Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Everybody can have a seat. Well, good afternoon. I want to welcome you all to the Jimmy Carter National Historic Site here in Plains, Georgia. It's an honor to have you here. This is a big day for me as a National Park Service ranger who served for 20 years and has worked in the Alaska region. And I just want to thank President Carter personally for your service to our country. I have a very special guest here with us right now, and this is Julia Washburn. And she is from the Washington office for the National Park Service, is in charge of education and interpretation. I'll let her speak a little bit to that. But welcome here. Thank you for being here, and God bless you all.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Mr. President. You have done so much for the National Park Service and for conservation. You signed into law in 1980 the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act that we know as ANILCA. That was huge for us. It added 43 million acres to the National Park Service and started 10 new national parks. And really was very important for wilderness and wilderness conservation, so thank you for doing that. We're so proud to have you all here today, and all of you who are at libraries and schools and universities all across the country. We think maybe there's around 90,000 students and participants in today's program, which is very exciting. And we are really thankful for our partners at Internet 2. Internet 2 is helping us reach people that we would never reach otherwise. So thank you so much. And with that, I have the great honor of introducing President Jimmy Carter.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Julie. It's a great pleasure to be here with you, and also, sorry?
I need to turn the mic on, I'm sorry.
Okay.
It's on. It's on.
Okay.
It's not working.
Testing.
Switch for Ms. Stacy.
Switch.
Switcheroo there.
Okay.
Oh, that's better.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. This is my place where I went to school for 11 years, and I learned how to take care of the outdoors with my father. And when I was governor, I had some run-ins with the Corps of Engineers who were trying to build dams all over Georgia, and I didn't want to build them. And when I got to be president, one of the first things I did the first week I was in the White House, as a matter of fact, was visit the Department of Interior. And I described to them then the beauty of Alaska and the history of the disputed lands in Alaska. It had been more than 20 years since Dwight Eisenhower was president. And at that time, he designated Alaska to be a state and Hawaii to be a state. And as they became the 49th and 50th states, there was still a very serious dispute or argument about what to do with all the land in Alaska. And then I worked out with some of the members of Congress and with my Secretary of State, Secretary of Interior, Cecil Andrews, the proposal that I wanted to make to the Congress, and I revealed it in a speech to the Congress in May of 1977, the first year I was in office. And I pointed out then that we had to set aside a very complicated series of land areas. And I studied for weeks the maps of Alaska, which were very complicated. I had to decide, first of all, how much land to give to the state of Alaska, where they could control it, own it, and provide law enforcement for it. I had to decide how much to retain for the federal government. It would not be in the park system or the wilderness system, and they would have control of it. I had to decide what to do with all the forest lands. There were tremendous forest lands there. I had to decide what areas would be open for hunting, just for private people to go and hunt and to fish, and how much to open up for commercial outfits that would hire a guide and pay visitors, tourists, a lot of money to go and hunt and fish on those precious lands. I had to decide how much land to give to the native Indians who lived there, and also the Eskimos, and they were competing with one another. Another decision I had to make was what to do about the oil, because I knew that certainly around the northern borders of Alaska, on the coastal areas, there was a lot of potential oil. There was a very special area called Anwar, which was set aside for wilderness area by President Eisenhower before he left office. And that was a special area that I wanted to protect. So you see, all of these things were very important to me. There were two U.S. senators from Alaska. Both of them were against doing anything. One of them was Republican Senator Ted Stevens, and also there was a Democratic senator as well. Eventually, his name was Mike Gravel. Senator Stevens, eventually, I induced him to support the legislation against his will. But he was opposing anything to be done with this land in Alaska except open it up to all exploration and things of that kind. And so Cecil Andrews and I found a law that was passed in 1906 that was called the Antiquities Act. And it gave the president the authority to set aside an area that surrounded a monument that the president thought was important to our country. And when it was passed, they were thinking about, some old church building or some courthouse building or some battlefield that had been prominent in the Revolutionary War or the Civil War. And that was it. But it didn't have any limitation on how much land would be included. So Cecil Andrews and I got the maps of Alaska, and we designated 12 areas in Alaska as a national monument. And the total area of those 12 parcels of land was bigger than the state of Minnesota. And when Ted Stevens saw that I could confiscate any land I wanted to in Alaska and designate it to be a national monument, he became converted to my side. So he gave me support from then on. And it was that key trick, you might say, or just a study of the law and use it for beneficial purposes that permitted us to put pressure on the opponents of the Alaska Lands Bill and induce them to support what we were trying to do. Well, it was a hard-fought battle. 4 years from the time I submitted the proposals in May of 1977 until after I was defeated for re-election in 1980. And as you've seen on the screen just a few minutes ago, it was a very fine ceremony, and environmentalists and others celebrated that act. It was still, after it passed, a very unpopular thing at first in Alaska. I remember they had a state fair up there in 1979, and I attended the state fair, and I had to double my Secret Service protection when I went into the state fair area with all the Alaska people there, because they were so furious at me because we had passed ANILCA. We're getting ready to pass ANILCA. And so they had one of those things where you throw baseballs. And they had my picture on one of them and the Ayatollah Khomeini on the other. And nobody wanted to throw at the Ayatollah Khomeini, they threw all the baseballs at me. So I knew what my standing was up there then. But let me just read from my notes here what happened when the Alaska Lands Bill was passed. First of all, the total area involved was bigger than the state of California, 103 million acres. Secondly, there was 97 million acres set aside for national parks areas, twice as much as the national parks had been in the past. There were 25 free-flowing streams, which doubled the size of the wild and scenic river system. There was 56 million acres, 3 times the size of the wilderness system, and 44 million acres I designated for the use of native Alaskans, that is, Eskimos and Indians. And we gave 100 million acres to the state of Alaska that they would own and control as a state enterprise. That was 5 times as much land, as by the way, has it ever been given to a state that became a member of the United States. So this was what we did. And then just a few weeks after I signed the Alaska Lands Bill, ANILCA, I went out of office, and Ronald Reagan came into office, a Republican president, and then the campaign against me, he called the ANILCA a notorious illegal land grab. And he swore to the American people when he was running for office that he would do away with it as soon as he became president. And he appointed a Secretary of Interior who was a disgrace to the outdoors named James White. And James White and Ronald Reagan tried every way they could to get rid of the Alaska Lands Bill. One thing they did also was to reduce the efficiency of automobiles that I had established when I was in office. If they had gone forward with what we had established when I was president, at the end of the year 2000, the average efficiency of all automobiles sold in America would have been 28 miles per gallon. But they reversed that decision. And the first step they took was to decrease the mileage of automobiles by 1.5 miles per gallon. And that cost more oil per year than all the oil in ANWR, the natural wildlife area. And if they had produced all the oil that they wanted to from this precious preserved area, it would have lasted America only 6 months. Well, that has been a constant battle since I left office, and that's about the only times when I have been back to Washington to lobby among members of Congress to block legislation, particularly the 8 years when President Reagan was in office. But every time we have prevailed. One time I remember just by 2 votes, and otherwise that whole area, precious area there, has been open to oil exploration. By the way, I might add quite quickly that when ANILCA was passed, we authorized that oil companies could explore and extract oil from 90% of all the coastal area of Alaska. So that's what happened while I was in office, and immediately after I left office with my successor. And since then, I've been to Alaska many times. I've been up to the very beautiful natural area up there, the Alaska Lands area, and I've been also fishing. My wife and I are avid fly fisher. I've caught Atlantic char, I've caught grayling, I've caught brown trout. I caught a 12-pound rainbow trout, my biggest rainbow trout of my life, and I've seen herds of antelope. There's a very wonderful area up there where you have, we have very large quantities of wildlife, and I've been close up to brown bear and also grizzly bears. I've had a chance to see musk oxen. In fact, one time we went into one of the islands off the northern coast of Alaska, and where musk oxen live. At that time, there were over 1,200 musk oxen living in the world, all the way across the top of Europe and Russia and Alaska, but they've been increasing ever since then. But my wife and I got down behind what they call a hammock, and we peeked over it and very quietly, and the musk oxen didn't see us. And finally, the guy had earphones on, and the game preserver behind me, the game ranger, said, "Why don't you scare them a little bit?" So I raised my hand and waved it around, and immediately the musk oxen formed a circle facing outward with all the bulls, and the cows and the calves were inside the circle, being protected by the bull's horns. And that's the way they protected themselves all the way through tens of thousands of years. But of course, you can very quickly see that doesn't work when people are standing on the outside with rifles in their hands. But anyway, we saw a lot of wonderful things. up in the northern part of Alaska. There was a lot of predictions that this would be a devastating blow to the Alaska economy, but that has not been true. I'll just give you my last part of my presentation here, how Alaska has fared. By the way, Alaska population has increased by more than 50%. Park visits are up 350%. Tourism has tripled. The timber and fishing is now exceeded by the tourist income. In other words, Alaska gets more money from just tourist visits now than they do from all the fishing and timber harvesting in Alaska. And now when tourists go there, they don't have to look at all wells. Everywhere they go in the Park Service areas, they don't have to listen to helicopters flying overhead or heavy snowmobiles running by them. So you see there's been a lot of advantages for Alaska, both economically and in the quality of life. So that ends my presentation, and now with some trepidation, I'll be glad to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, President Carter, for that presentation. Our first question is from Courtney Barber from Ware County High School in Waycross, Georgia.
Hi, Courtney.
Mr. President, do you think growing up on a farm in Plains and also your involvement in Future Farmers of America influenced you to be more conservation-minded and ultimately had a bearing on decisions you made as president to support the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act?
Well, there's no doubt about it. I grew up on a farm west of Plains. I was a small boy, 4 years old, when we moved out there from the big city of Plains to the farm. My father was very dedicated to outdoors. He was a fisherman. He took me fishing on the streams around there, and also to South Georgia around Waycross, Georgia, the Pinocchio Swamp when I was a kid. And he taught me the beauty of the earth. And also back in those days, in all the churches in Plains, by the way, now we have 11 churches with just 650 people. So you see we're very heavily dedicated to religion. But every year back in those days, we had a special Sunday set aside for the preservation of the quality of the earth. And we were given sermons out of the Bible teaching us that every Christian has an obligation or a duty to protect the beauty of the earth that God gave to us. There was a very strong conservation program initiated by congressional districts. And we lived in the 3rd congressional district then, and my father was a leader in the conservation districts. So he put terraces on all our land, and it was kind of a new thing to do in Georgia at that time. And my father taught me that it was an important part of my life, just as a private citizen, not particularly a governor or a president, to preserve the beauty and quality of the atmosphere, the streams, and the earth on which we live. So there's no doubt about the fact that my early training as a boy under my father's leadership, and under the leadership of what I learned in church, really had a great impact on my commitment to doing the same thing for Alaska. When I arrived in the White House and found that this problem had existed ever since the time when President Eisenhower left office. Thank you for your question.
Our next question is from Glen Ellen High School in Glen Ellen, Alaska. And are you on? Glen Ellen, Alaska. There they are.
Right there in the screen there,
John Scott will be asking the question, and you can go ahead and ask the question. Glen Ellen High School from Glen Ellen, Alaska.
As young people who depend on the conservation lands, will we be able to use the lands for subsistence activities, such as hunting, fishing, gathering berries, and firewood, as we grow up and raise families?
Any citizen of Alaska, or even any tourist who goes there, is free to go with a proper permit and hunt or fish on the land. The only exception is that there are some precious wilderness areas, very small in size, by the way, compared to the Park Service and so forth land, that you cannot use. But within the bounds of reason, yes, and the vastness of Alaska will give you plenty of room. In fact, I've fished all over Alaska. I haven't been hunting up there yet. I just hunt around my home farms here in Georgia. But there's no doubt about the fact that young people will have a chance to use the outdoors much better than you would have had you not had the Alaskan land bill to set aside it and to protect it from unnecessary use of it by professional hunters, fishermen, and others who might keep you out of their property. So yes, you have as much land open to you as there is anywhere in the world. And I might point out that Alaska is by far the largest state. There used to be arguments between Texans and Alaskans about who had the largest state. And I remember that Alaska told the Texan, if you don't shut up, we're going to cut Alaska half in two and make Texas the third largest state. So you'll have plenty of room to do everything you want to.
The next question is from Kayla from Woodrow Wilson Junior High in Dayton, Texas.
Woodrow Wilson Junior High. Woodrow Wilson Junior High, Dayton, Texas. Kayla Pruitt. In my history class, Miss Jones discussed the importance of civic virtue. Do you believe this is an important characteristic of a leader, and why?
Well, civic virtue really means, in my opinion, what a citizen of any country in the world should do to enhance the quality of life of the people that live with you as neighbors, or particularly those that might come later after your life is over, when your children and grandchildren inherit what you leave behind. So there's no doubt in my mind that civic virtue is a very important aspect of life, no matter what your age might be. And there's no doubt either that children your age and younger and older school children and those in college are at a time in life when your civic virtues can be shaped but also put into effect. Because it's during this time in your life that you'll be probably more free than you will later on when you get a job and you have to please your bosses, or you get married and have to please your husband. I see you go. And so these are the kind of things that I think are very important. So civic virtue just means taking care of what I mentioned earlier, the world that God has given you, to protect it from your fellow, protect it for your fellow citizens and for your descendants in the future. Thank you.
The next question is from Pablo from Southwest High School in El Centro, California.
Dear Mr. President, my name is Pablo from Southwest High School. How can we as citizens of the United States continue your legacy and protect our natural resources? It worries me that we will damage everything for our next generation.
Well, I think one of the ways you can protect what we left behind 30 years ago or so when I left the White House and signed ANILCA, the Alaskan Lands Bill, is to assess your own neighborhood, that part of the world in which you have some influence, and which you might either protect or damage yourself. And if you see your fellow students or even your adults who live around you doing something that you feel would damage the quality of the earth, or cut down unnecessary trees, or do something that might spoil a stream or pollute the air, then speak out about it. And if you feel that your own voice is not adequate, get other students who agree with you on protecting the quality of the world in which you live, and get them together and go and visit your local officials, the police or the sheriffs or the mayor and city council, or maybe your county commissioners, or write a letter to your local newspaper and sign all your names to it, and just say, we saw this happening and we think it's wrong for the quality of the life in our community, and we want to put a stop to it, and I guarantee you that your voice will be heard. So just be alert, protect everything around you, don't be hesitant or afraid to speak out when it's necessary. Thank you.
Our next next question comes from Malia Daly in Sugar Salem High School in Sugar City, Idaho.
Hi, Mr. President. How does the Alaska National Interest Land Conservation Act continue to affect our country today, and what is its significance to me as an American teenager?
By the way, Idaho is a home of Cecil Andrews, my Secretary of Interior that I mentioned, who was really one of the heroes in getting this legislation passed, and you can be proud of him and the impact of Idaho and its citizens on the rest of the country. Similarly, I think Alaska can be proud of having a repository of precious land that is available not just to people who live in Alaska, but to people from all over the state, all over our country. And that's one of the main arguments that we made when we were trying to get the Congress to vote for this legislation, was to convince them this is not just an Alaskan bill, this is an American bill. Because what happens in Alaska will be making available to all citizens who go to Alaska as tourists a wonderful opportunity they probably may not find in their own states. Even Idaho, as beautiful as it is and how well protected your outdoors is, doesn't have a lot of things that Alaska does because of its diversity of climate, because of its size, and because of its location in the upper part of the hemisphere, where it gets very cold in one part and warmer in another. So I would say that the ANILCA has had a permanent complementary or beneficial effect on everyone who lives in the United States of America, and also on everyone who lives in all the rest of the nations in the world. Alaska is a treasure to be visited, and when I go there now to visit, I would say that in an average group of tourists, sometimes half of them are from other countries, not just the United States. So it has some folks in Idaho, it has some folks in China, it has some folks in South Africa, it has some folks in Yemen, it has some folks in Nepal, it has some folks in India. So I think that answers your question, whatever you wanted me to. Thank you.
Our next question is coming from our live audience here in the auditorium, from Brianna Taylor from Heritage Middle School in Ringgold, Georgia.
Mr. President, what would you say was the major controversy regarding the signing and passage of this act?
Well, the major controversy was the fact that both U.S. senators and the only congressman that Alaska has were really heavily influenced by the commercial interest. The commercial fishermen who didn't want any land set aside, any stream set aside for private fishing. And for people who were professional hunters who didn't want to open up hunting rights to people or to visit set aside national parks or wilderness areas. And I would say particularly the oil companies, they wanted to have unlimited ability to explore for oil and to extract oil from anywhere in Alaska. And also there was a great controversy between just arguments. It went on between the state officials, the federal officials, the American Indians, the Eskimos, and others who lived in Alaska, all squabbling to get those hundreds of millions of acres of land that had been sitting dormant ever since Alaska became a state. So those were some of the arguments against it. And the Alaska members of the Congress would tell some of the other members of Congress, look, this is a private affair. You don't have any right to get involved in it. You let us three senators in one Congress, two senators in one Congress would make all the decisions about Alaska. We don't want people from Idaho and Georgia and anyone else being involved in our affairs. So those were the main arguments that I remember that were launched against us, but eventually we convinced the Congress it was the right thing to do. And now everybody in Alaska is very glad it happened.
Thank you.
This next question was submitted by Kelly Quist, a high high school in Naknek, Alaska, and because they are unable to connect, they have asked that we read this for them on their behalf. When ANILCA was promulgated, how was it received in the Native community? And what, if any, objections were voiced?
Well, let's distinguish between Native community by just mostly Caucasian or white citizens of Alaska on the one hand who were basically against it, and the Native Alaskans, that is the Eskimos and the Native Indians, who basically were for it because they had been excluded pretty much from any opportunity to enjoy their land. And the original rights that were given to those Native Americans and Eskimos about special privileges for fishing in certain streams and so forth were being slowly taken away from them by action of politicians in Juneau, which was the capital of Alaska. So those were some of the things about the natives. But I would say that overwhelmingly, at first for Alaska, when ANILCA was proposed and when they were fighting for it, the average citizen in Alaska who was not an Eskimo or an Indian was strongly against ANILCA being passed because they heard the newspapers were against it, the radio stations were against it, the TV stations were against it, all three members of the Congress were against it, but the rest of the Congress had better judgment. And maybe somebody in the White House had better judgment too.
Our next question is from Alexis from Woodrow Wilson Junior High, Dayton, Texas.
Woodrow Wilson Junior High, Dayton, Texas, Alexis Dallas. The actions of the United States and its president impact the entire world. What initiatives would you like to spread to other countries regarding the importance of protecting the world's natural resources?
What initiatives would you like to spread to other countries?
Well, I think in all over the world now, one of the big questions is that of global warming. The last time I was in Alaska, going around the coast of Alaska, some of the native villages were already being flooded by the oceans rising very slightly. And when the sea rises just maybe 1 foot, and you get normal storms, then the village floods out. So they're having to move from one place to another. And the last time I landed in an airplane in Alaska and got off the plane, the headlines in the major newspaper in Fairbanks, Alaska was, polar bears have 25 years and then they will be extinct. So the pressures of global warming, that is slow warming of atmosphere because we have burned so much oil and so forth and polluted the atmosphere, is a slow and inevitable development that has to be corrected. So now, as you know, there are frequent meetings, one in Japan, in Tokyo, later one in Rio de Janeiro, when George H.W. Bush was president, one 20 years later in Rio, recently in Europe, where nations are coming together, that is the United States and China and India and all the European countries and others, to say, what can we do collectively to cut down on the pollution, further pollution of the atmosphere with carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide. That's one of the major things that people can do. On a more local basis, though, I would say that people in every country can begin to take better care of their air and their water and their general surroundings. One of the countries that's suffering most right now is China. If you go to China, sometimes you can find an atmosphere that makes it almost impossible for you to breathe safely. I traveled through one of the rural areas of China, one of the counties, not too far from Xingtao, with former Senator Sam Nunn and his wife and my wife. One time, they have 14 creeks in that county, and every creek was so bad it's polluted that they couldn't use the water for bathing, for fishing, for drinking, or even to irrigate their crops. So China is now making major moves to correct its own problems, but when China corrects its own problems, particularly with air pollution, it will help every country in the world. The United States is still the most guilty country on earth about polluting the atmosphere because we're such a highly industrialized country. But China is increasing very rapidly, and soon we'll be the two worst polluters. So I would say that every country on earth has a responsibility for this. I hope that answers your question.
Our next question is from Alexis in Southwest High School in El Centro, California.
Hi.
Hello.
Good afternoon, Mr. President. My name is Alexis Estrada from Southwest High School, and my question is, why are businesses allowed to build over our natural land, and how can we stop this?
Why are businesses allowed to go on natural land and how can we
Why
stop it?
I'll repeat the question. Why are businesses allowed to build over our natural land, and how can we stop this?
Well, businesses are not permitted to build in a national park or wilderness area. But there's still some areas of even Alaska that are still uncertain about their status. Part of the ANILCA legislation gave the Secretary of Interior the authority to go back to Congress with additional recommendations if he thought there was more places in Alaska that needed to be protected. And I think that very few of the Secretaries of the Interior have taken advantage of this requirement in the law. Also, the Antiquities Act that I mentioned earlier that gave me the right to set aside lands to be preserved under that 1906 law is still there. And I know that Anwar, which is a very precious wilderness area in Alaska, is still kind of in danger. That is, if the Congress and the President agree, then all countries should go to this very precious preserved area and begin to explore for oil. If I had one request to make of President Obama, it would be designate Anwar to be a national monument under the Antiquities Act, and then it would be protected forever. So I don't think the businesses can go into any of the lands that have been protected under ANILCA or any other of the lands that has been included in before I became president in the national park system.
That's correct.
So my seniors on my right agree with me. Thank you very much.
Next question is from Connor Stoddard from Sugar Salem High School in Sugar Salem, Idaho.
Mr. President, during your time as president, you focused on protecting and conserving our natural resources. What is my role in helping to protect the environment?
Well, your role is the same as mine was when I was a younger person, when I was a college student. And I'd say your role is the same as mine was when I was governor of Georgia and also president of the United States. And that is to look around and see what area of the world comes under your influence. It may be just your own yard, it might be some open places in your town where you live. It may be areas that are controlled by your local government. It may be some areas that you think are very precious that should be preserved and protected for historical purposes just because it's especially beautiful. Now, I don't know exactly what the area is around your home, but I think that you should be constantly alert throughout your life as a student and later as an adult, and then maybe you hold public office in the future, and say, what can I do to make sure that when I have some influence or responsibility on a particular area of land or the air or water around me, that I can help protect it. So be alert. See any danger you witness to the beauty and quality of the world that God gave us and protect it with all your resources and all your intelligence and all your strength.
question is from Dr. Bergerman, professor at the Georgia Southwestern University in Americus, Georgia.
Good afternoon, Mr. Carter.
Hi, Roger.
Mr. Carter, compared to the other achievements of your presidency, such as the Camp David Accords, Panama Canal treaties, relations with China, where would you rank ANILCA? Was ANILCA your most important domestic policy achievement and legacy? Thank you.
I would say that ANILCA and my comprehensive energy policy were the two most important domestic achievements of my administration. And luckily, the provisions of ANILCA have been preserved and protected. My comprehensive energy policy, a lot of it has not survived, primarily because of lobbying pressure put on my successes in the White House. I described what happened with automobile efficiency earlier, where President Reagan just almost did away with the restrictions on automobile efficiency, which would have saved us enormous amounts of money and so forth. So a lot of the energy policy was in law and couldn't be changed just by presidents directly. But I never predicted when I was in office that the future president would want to go backwards on energy policy or anything else. So I would say that between those two, which I think are the most important, ANILCA would be at the top because it was set in law and because all the Congress and others have been able since then to withstand the attempts made by several presidents to amend the local legislation to damage Alaska. So I think I've answered your question. ANILCA would be number one. Thanks, Doctor.
Our next question is from Kirsten Jacobson from Sugar Salem High School in Sugar City, Idaho.
Sage food.
Mr. President.
Yes.
Mr. President, my name's Alan Dunn. I'm the superintendent of schools here, and we were unaware that we had another question, so we will just pass on this and move on to the next question. Thank you.
That's very gracious of you. Thank you very much.
I can ask it on your behalf.
Go ahead and answer.
Okay, I'll ask. Kirsten's question was, under what circumstances, if any, should the U.S. start oil drilling in Alaska?
Well, I answered that earlier. In the Anamore, which is the game preserve, it's a large area in the north part of Alaska, there should never be any oil drilling done. But in ANILCA, in the legislation that we're discussing this afternoon, we authorize 90% of all the potential oil drilling areas in Alaska to be explored for oil and for oil to be extracted by oil companies. So it was only 10% in this wildlife reserve that was set aside not to be extracted. And that's what I would like to see continued forever, is 90% to be extracted, just leave that 110% where the large herds and so forth breed without being extracted or exploited for oil.
Next questions will come from our live audience. This one is from the Carrollton High School, and I'll just read them on their behalf. What do you foresee the next frontier of conservation looking like?
Well, I think I mentioned that already. I think the next frontier of conservation is really dealing with global warming. That was first detected, by the way, when I happened to be president. I didn't have anything to do with it. But there was a scientist at Woods Hole, which is a research center for the oceans in Massachusetts, who said that he believed he had found out that the Earth was warming regularly, increasing in temperature a little bit every year, and his belief was that it was caused by the excessive burning of fossil fuels and the buildup of CO2 in the atmosphere that trapped some of the heat that would ordinarily escape from the Earth into the atmosphere. And since then, that has proven to be true. And this is an issue that has not yet been resolved. We have a very steady increase in temperature. I already mentioned what's happening to some of the villages on the coastal areas of Alaska, where they have to abandon the villages and move. I would say the first country that's going to be affected adversely with the whole country would be Bolivia. Bolivia is a nation in the middle of southern South America. It's landlocked, and they get most of their water for irrigation and for drinking and for everything else from the melted snow of the mountains, and all from the glaciers, and all the glaciers are now melting away. We have a wonderful national park called Glacier National Park, and in a few more years there's not going to be any more glaciers in the Glacier National Park because the ice is melting on the high areas because of the increased warming. And there's some claims that I personally believe are true, that the increase in devastation like this happened recently in the Philippines is caused by global warming because the earth is rising and the area that the oceans are rising, and the areas around the coastal areas are much more susceptible to flooding. Now when you get a powerful storm, and some of the storms are the most powerful we've known in history. So global warming would be the next challenge in dealing with the environment.
Tyler Brown from Southland Academy has asked, how did you decide which lands were worth protecting and which lands were not?
Well, when I got to be president, as I said, I knew that this was a burning issue that had not been resolved for many, many years, and it needed to be, the question needed to be answered. What are we going to do with all this land that's just being held in abeyance because nobody had any legal right to do anything with it? So I studied the maps with my Secretary of Interior, whom I've mentioned several times, Cecil Andrews. We had a very good group of members of the House of Representatives and also in the Senate that had been working on this problem even before I became president. They had not had any support much from the White House and couldn't do anything about it. So when I got there, I had a lot of allies and friends that would work very closely with me. And we brought in people from Alaska that had special interest in setting aside certain areas to be wilderness areas. Those wilderness areas, by the way, are much more carefully protected than a national park. You can't touch or change a wilderness area in any way. If you build a fire, for instance, in a wilderness area, which I have done several times, at the end of your visit, you have to get all the coals from a dead fire, where the fire used to be, put them in a basket or a sack, and carry them out with you. You can't change anything. You can't shoot a gun in a wilderness area, and so forth. So I think those kind of questions were something that I couldn't answer from the White House. So it was from people that knew the details of communities in Alaska and the exact configuration of the stream, what kind of fish were in this stream or that stream, what kind of hunting might be permitted and what might not be permitted. We had people from the Eskimos and Native Indians come to the White House to tell us what their special needs were. So for 4 years, I spent a lot of my time studying every detail of the provisions that went into the Alaska Lands Bill. And it was a very thick bill. I don't remember how many pages it was, probably more than 1,000 pages that described in detail what could be done. So it was with a lot of very wise and deeply interested people advising me on what went into the bill that finally formulated what the bill was.
Jake Woodrow from the Woodrow Wilson Junior High in Dayton, Texas. See? Okay, I'll ask it on this.
Woodrow Wilson Junior High, Jake Torres, Dayton, Texas, Jake Torres. Mr. President, if you had to initiate a new legislation to conserve natural resources today, which resources would you protect and why?
Well, if I were president now, maybe? Well, if I were president now, the first thing I would do, I think, for as Alaska is concerned, is I would take Anwar, this precious area I talked about, and I would put it in the monument category so nobody could explore for oil in that one area of Alaska. And if I were president now and dealing with the global problems and not just Alaska, then I would be very careful to let the United States be a leader in dealing with the question of global warming. I was in China last year, and I was talking to the new leader of China. His name is Xi Jinping. And I suggested to him that if the United States and China would get together and make a proposal to the rest of the nations in the world about what to do about global warming, I think the rest of the countries would go along with the recommendation made by these two important nations, who are also the two most important polluters of the air above our world now. So dealing with Anwar, the wildlife area in Alaska, and dealing with global warming would be the two issues that I would address as top priorities if I were in the White House again.
Rachel Doggett from Southland Academy has this question. What are the greatest dangers to the conservation effort in Alaska?
Well, I don't know that there are very many dangers to the areas that we've designated as national forests or as wilderness areas. One of the dangers is building excessive roads in the national forest lands. And this is something that has been pursued by the forest industry quite a lot. And I've been basically opposed to it because if they do this in order to extract more timber from the major forest areas, particularly the Tongass National Forest, which is the main one in argument, then we would spend in taxpayers' money about $80,000 a year for every job created. If they built all the roads they wanted to through this very precious and beautiful area, it would only create 300 jobs for logging operations, and it would cost, to repeat myself, $80,000 per job per year. So you could give all those people a nice income without them working and save the taxpayers a lot of money. So those kind of things are going to constantly be probed by people who want to usurp the land away from the public interest. And I think that the Congress and the President, and also the Interior Department officials, have to be vigilant and make sure they detect those efforts as early as possible so they can prevent them happening. Because the oil companies never stop, and some of the other commercial interests never stop in trying to take things that belong to all the people of America and use it for just a few years benefit, and then after that, it's for everyone. That's the question or the challenge or the test that we have to face in the future successfully.
McKenna Ingram from the Southland Academy in Americas has asked this question. What are the plans for balancing business in Alaska and keeping the beauty of Alaska from being disturbed?
I think the Alaska Lands Bill, ANILCA, answered that question better than I can answer it. We not only considered the people interest that I described to you earlier, the Native Indians and so forth, but we also had a lot of very responsible business leaders who came to the White House or came to the Congress, and they described what their legitimate needs were. And I would say that now the commercial fishermen have just as good an opportunity to make a profit as they did before Untitled passed, maybe even better. And there are a lot of areas of Alaska that have now been open for people to go in and rent a snowmobile and ride through the areas on the snow. They still have plenty of land to do that, the opportunity for them to do that. There's a few places in the national parks where they do permit snowmobiles to go. But that's very carefully controlled. So I would say that there's a very good balance now between business interest and the interest of preserving certain precious areas where business cannot usurp and take away the beauty and the permanent benefit of it to all the American people.
Okay, and the last question we have is from Quinn Hansen from Southland Academy in Americus, Georgia. When choosing which state you would give the Conservation Act to, why did you choose a state so far away, where many people are unable to enjoy the wildlife and the resources you are trying to conserve?
Well, a lot of Georgians go to Alaska on vacation, and a lot of Alaskans, I'm sure, come to Georgia also for vacation. But the reason we did address Alaska and not the 48 states here on the continent was because of its long overdue prevention of legislation being passed by special interest groups. As I said 2 or 3 times already this afternoon, this question had been raised over hundreds of millions of acres of land in Alaska for more than 20 years before I became president. And none of the presidents were willing to face the conflict and all the furor that was raised when the legislation was put forward in a real serious way. And so that's why we had to deal with Alaska, because it was long overdue, millions and millions of acres of land. And a lot of people were waiting to get their real benefits from the land in which they lived. And I mentioned the Eskimos and Native Indians several times already this afternoon. And not only those, but also the people that live in Alaska permanently that are not natives of Alaska. As everyone knows, we bought Alaska from Russia quite early in the 20th century, in the early 1900s. I think we paid about $7 million for the entire Alaska from the Russians, which was the best bargain, I believe, that the United States ever got in dealing with the Russians or anybody else. So it was a precious possession, and it was all that time from 1907 until Eisenhower was president in the 1950s that Alaska wanted to become a state. But the Congress was unwilling to make Alaska a state because it was overwhelmingly Republican. And the Democratic Congresses did not want to have a Republican state added to the total. But Hawaii, who was also not a state, was basically Democratic. So when President Eisenhower was president, he said, why don't we do this? Why don't we make Alaska and Hawaii a state at the same time, one Democratic, one Republican state, and then the balance will be maintained. So that was what happened between 1903 or whatever it was and the 1950s. But from the 1950s until 1977, when I became president, that 20 years, as I said, nobody knew what to do with Alaska. And the Congress and I decided this is what we should do. And I think it's one of the best decisions that's ever been made by a president and Congress concerning lands and the benefit of the people, I hope in eternity, who live in America and who live in the rest of the world to enjoy this precious possession. And I would urge anybody listening to this telecast or broadcast this afternoon, if when you get a chance, go to Alaska and see what we did. I think you'll be proud of this state and proud of your country. Thank you.
That end our program for today, and I want to thank you, President Carter, for being our guest, Julia Washington for coming from Washington to be our guest, and for the 28+ schools that are in our live audience that are from Georgia, as well as the Texas and Dayton. We have Idaho, we have California, we have Texas, and Glen Ellen, Alaska, and Naknek, Alaska. It's all involved interactively, and all of you that have dialed in and contributed and participated in some way today. Thank you, and this concludes our program for today.
Thank you.